Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2023 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, the Artistic Director, and Nina Strike, Founder and Festival Director, in conversation with the filmmaker Riley Tinlin, while we discuss her film, Overdose and Oppression. This film will be a part of a shorts program that you can see at our upcoming 2023 film festival. Please go to peacefilmfest.org for more information. And now let's welcome Riley Tinlin. Riley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking about my film.
Hi, Riley. It's great to see you. And so to start with, tell us about the film.
Yes, so Overdose and Oppression was something that started out as my senior thesis in college, but quickly transformed into kind of a passion project of mine. I wanted to look into not only like the United States opioid epidemic as a whole, but specifically how it's affected queer communities as they're routinely neglected in contemporary care settings. And in doing this, I wanted to kind of look at a wide perspective of expertise on the issue, talking to both field experts and legal experts, some policymakers, and then also some of my family members. As my uncle died of an opioid overdose when I was a kid, he was a gay man, and that had a lot to do with his experience. And it was something that wasn't really talked about a lot when I was a kid. So I wanted to use this film to kind of take a deeper look into how this affected not only my family, but the greater American population.
Well, Riley, you really touched on how you came to be so closely associated with this film and why you chose to do this. But can you talk a little bit about how facing this issue face on may be actually more helpful than not talking about it?
Yeah, so I think a big part of the lack of care options is that people with opioid addictions and people with addictions in general are kind of shunned from mainstream society. They're not really given any form of community. They're not really given any form of support. They're viewed as like lesser than. And a lot of people view this as like a lifestyle choice. But in a lot of my research, what I found is that it's most often used as a coping mechanism. And that a lot of the people, specifically queer users that are using to escape the pain and stigma that comes along with not having their identity validated in spaces. So I think the first step in kind of having that community of people that will support addicts and support anyone and seeing them as people before we see them as addicts is talking about that and understanding that a lot of people that are using, it's a lot deeper than just, oh, I want to get high, or, oh, I'm doing this because it feels good. There's a lot of other factors that go into it that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. So I think it's important that there's just kind of a baseline understanding. And I know, like in my experience, I never learned about this at all in school. It was never something that was talked about in my formal education. And so when I started researching this, I was really shocked by how much not only was left out, but how much like misinformation that I received about opioid abuse. So I think it's important to start the conversation and to lead people to have conversations with people whose lives have been directly affected by this. I think there's a lot of humanity that's being lost because there's not any conversation happening.
That's a great point, the humanity aspect of it, because listening to your answer, talking about the ways in which often addiction is treated as a personal failing, when there are much larger societal and structural things that need to bear. And certainly in terms of the approach, one of the other films that we have programmed with your film looks at addiction treatment through meditation and mindfulness and helping people to deal with the triggers that have developed over time. And so I think that's a fascinating way that your film actually tackles two things at once. Tackles certainly one of the underlying addiction vulnerabilities, as you mentioned, the lack of societal embrace and identification with the queer community, but also a different way of approaching the actual treatment. And can you talk a little bit about what you learned about that?
100%. So I think a lot of people have this misunderstanding that if someone really wants to, they'll just stop using. And specifically with opioids, that's not possible. And for a lot of people, if they just quit cold turkey, it would lead to death, or they would stop for a few months. And then when they haven't fixed any of the underlying issues, they would start using again. They talk about this a lot in the film, some of the experts I interviewed, but a large percentage of people who have stopped using have been in programs where they could use safely, because it's not about cutting it out of your life completely. It's about finding ways to use safely so that you're using less, because you find other things to supplement what you're using the drugs to cope with. So for example, if you feel completely alone and you're depressed because you don't have community, stepping into a space that provides you with that support, even if drugs are involved, it's going to make you want to use less, because you're finding one of the factors that you're missing. A lot of people that use are also missing housing. They don't have access to showers. They don't have access to food. Giving them those things is going to make them less likely to use. I also think that it allows them to see themselves as people. I think a lot of addicts lose a sense of identity because of the way, as I talked about, they're so shunned from mainstream society. I think if you put them in a space where they're valued and validated as human beings, they then see more potential in themselves and are more likely to want to stop using. But I also think, like, for me, I'm a big proponent of harm reduction, as I talked about using drugs in safe spaces, but I'm also a big proponent of meditation. I'm a big proponent of, you can't fix a problem like addiction without looking at the mental health issues that go along with that. So I'm very interested to watch the film that you were talking about. I think the two go hand in hand. I mean, I think for some people, while getting care for your mental health is a huge part of the puzzle, I think that they also need that community support and social supports to keep them off the streets, to keep them in spaces where they feel safe to experiment with abstinence. I just think that a lot of people's conceptions of how we get individuals to stop using drugs are unrealistic, and we need to look at the full picture and realize the supports they need, the evidence-based theories that actually work, and listen to people who have used, people who are on the front lines working with this. I think that there's just a lot of misconceptions about what addiction looks like and what comprehensive addiction treatment looks like. So I'm hoping with films like mine and the one that you were talking about, and also just like, I feel like there's been a big boom in the harm reduction community. From what I've seen, I mean, like, Florida's a pretty conservative state, and I was shocked by how many harm reduction communities, when I was doing the research for my film, I was shocked by how many organizations there are, even just in like the Central Florida Winter Park community. I think we just need to elevate those and have those voices be heard, because they're kind of being drowned out in the sea of like abstinence only, not propaganda, education.
Exactly. And that brings me to the next question about our central mission at the festival, is to show films like yours and others that provide models, ways, frameworks of looking at the world, things that they can bring back into their own lives, into their own communities, to make the world a better, more peaceful place. So could you talk a little bit about what you would hope people would take away, and the resources that you hope they would explore?
100%. So I talked about this a little bit before, but I think the biggest thing that I want my film to show people is the importance of viewing people, regardless of their drug status, regardless of their gender, sexuality, race, class, etc., to view them as people first, rather than maybe the labels that they identify with. So you could go on the street and see someone, say you see a homeless user under the I-4 overpass, and you immediately write them off as lesser than, or this kind of person, and you're making these kind of subconscious judgments towards them. Take a step back and kind of think about, why do I think this? I don't know this person. I've never talked to them. Why is that my immediate reaction? And that's kind of what I want my film to inspire in people. I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I mean, that's something that I do work in this, and I still find myself trying to unpack some of those thoughts, but I think this is a good starting point. And I hope that by starting there, maybe now it just looks like looking and smiling at the person that they passed on the street instead of ignoring them. And then maybe in a year, when they feel more comfortable, they've look into harm reduction, and they go to a harm reduction clinic. And even if you're not comfortable maybe working at the syringe exchange, just talking to people who this is their career, this is their experience, and actually learning about the issue from a firsthand perspective rather than thinking you know things when you've never done the work to look into it.
So that's fascinating, Riley, and so important to see every individual as a human being, no matter what their circumstances or where they are. So to wrap this up, your focus is much more on the issue rather than the film itself. So talk a little more about what people can do, and also talk about what's next for you, and is another film in your future, or is your future going to do? Are you going to do other things in the future?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things people can do is find out what your local harm reduction organizations are and support them. Also look at the policymakers in your specific county, state, federal, anyone that's running for office. Make sure that they're supporting things that you agree with, especially in terms of harm reduction. I know for my Central Florida folks, Anna Escamani is doing great work in that. She's part of the film. I think just being conscious that this is an issue and seeing how the issues of addiction are wide reaching, and I think looking at how they weave their way into other social issues is important. So just be conscious of that. But yeah, supporting local harm reduction organizations, I would say, is the biggest way to support this issue. For me, I definitely want to make more films in the future. I'm currently in grad school, so I'm not really sure what that'll look like now. I'm looking at getting involved with some harm reduction organizations here, which I'm super excited about. But other than that, I'm not really sure what the future holds, but I'm excited to find out.
Fantastic, Riley. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really been insightful to get a sense of, what motivated you to make this film. And we thank you for sharing your time with it, and sharing this film with our audiences.
Thank you guys for having me.
And thank you to everyone who's watched today's conversation with Riley Tinlin, the filmmaker behind Overdose and Oppression. For more information on the issue, as Riley has mentioned, please check out harmreduction.org as an organization that will give you more resources and more opportunity to engage with this issue. That's harmreduction.org. And again, please go to peacefilmfest.org to check out our full schedule. Our in-person events begin September 19th and run through September the 23rd. And our virtual streaming shorts and features will be available starting September 25th through October the 1st. Thank you again, and we'll see you at the next Glow.